The world was seconds away from losing the most powerful communication tool ever created. Not to a war, not to a natural disaster, but to a single decision made by a small group of men in a government office who had no idea what they were holding in their hands. This is the story of how the internet almost never became yours. Picture a world without search engines, without social media, without online banking, video calls, digital maps, or streaming. A world where knowledge couldn't travel at the speed of light, where revolutions couldn't organize in minutes, where a teenager in rural India couldn't access the same library as a professor at Harvard. That world was almost our world. And what stood between those two realities was a political battle so obscure, so buried in bureaucratic language, that most people alive today have never heard of it. To understand how close we came, we need to go back, far back, to a time when the internet existed, but only barely, and only for a few. It is the late 1980s. The Cold War is still casting its long shadow over the planet. In research laboratories across the United States, a strange and miraculous network is humming quietly to life. It was originally called ARPANET, built by the American military to allow computers to talk to each other, even in the event of a nuclear strike. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of one central hub that could be destroyed, information would travel in packets, bouncing between nodes, finding its own path. A network that could survive the end of the world. But by the late 80s, something unexpected was happening. Scientists, researchers, and university professors had gotten their hands on this technology, and they were using it not for military strategy, but to share ideas, trade research, collaborate across continents. A small, brilliant community was quietly building something they didn't fully understand yet. Something that would change everything. And then the United States government had to decide what to do with it. Here is where the tension begins. Because in Washington, there was a problem. The internet, still in its early form, was running on infrastructure funded by the National Science Foundation, a government agency. It was explicitly forbidden from commercial use. The rules were clear. You could use the network for research and education. But the moment someone tried to make money with it, that was a violation. That was against the rules. And some people in power wanted to keep it that way, forever. Think about that for a moment. The internet, as a public, commercial, democratic tool and the kind you use every day, was never guaranteed. There were serious, intelligent, influential people who believed this network should remain a closed academic resource, a private garden for scientists and universities, not a public highway for everyone. And for a while, they were winning that argument. But that wasn't the worst part. Even among those who wanted to open the internet to the public, there was a far more dangerous idea being quietly discussed. What if, instead of letting the internet grow freely, the government simply took control of it? What if telecommunications giants, massive, powerful companies like AT&T, which had already monopolized the telephone system, were handed the keys to this new network? This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was a real proposal. Serious conversations were happening in corridors of power about whether the internet should be privatized into the hands of just one or two corporate giants who would then control every piece of information that traveled across it. Who could access it? What it could be used for? How much it would cost? If that had happened, the internet as we know it, open, decentralized, democratic, chaotic, free, would never have existed. What they didn't realize was that a small group of people, many of them idealistic, some of them young, almost none of them politicians, were about to change the entire course of history. The person at the center of this story is not a name most people know. His name was Rick Boucher, a congressman from Virginia. Not a tech visionary, not a Silicon Valley legend. Just a lawmaker who understood something crucial before almost anyone else in government did. He understood that if the internet was going to fulfill its potential, it needed to be freed, opened up, made available to businesses, to entrepreneurs, to ordinary people. In 1992, Boucher co-sponsored a bill that would change the rules of the National Science Foundation network, the backbone of the early internet, and explicitly allow commercial activity on it. It sounds almost boring when you say it like that, a bill, a rule change, bureaucratic language on paper. But this single piece of legislation was the detonator. It was the thing that could either blow the doors open, or if it failed, seal them shut forever. And it almost failed. The opposition was fierce, and it came from multiple directions at once. First, there were the academics, researchers and scientists who had built this network, who had nurtured it, who saw it as their intellectual community. They were terrified that commercialization would corrupt it, flood it with advertising, destroy the culture of open collaboration they had worked so hard to build. Their fear wasn't irrational, it came from love. Second, there were the telecommunications corporations. Companies like AT&T had spent decades building the telephone infrastructure of America. They had lobbied, negotiated, and maneuvered their way into a position of enormous power. Now here came this new network, and they wanted a piece of it, but not just a piece. They wanted control. Some of the most powerful lobbyists in Washington were pushing hard for a version of the internet that would look much more like cable television, centralized, controlled, with someone at the top deciding what was on and what wasn't. And then something unexpected happened. The Cold War ended. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it came a profound shift in American political thinking. The government no longer needed to hold its most powerful technologies close to its chest. The logic of keeping the internet as a military and academic resource, a resource too sensitive, too strategic for the general public, began to crumble. A new era was opening up, an era of expansion, of optimism, of a belief that technology and freedom could march forward together. This was the window. And the people who wanted to open the internet understood they needed to move through it fast before it closed. Meanwhile, in a small office at CERN, the European Physics Laboratory in Switzerland, a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee was quietly building something that would make everything else irrelevant if the political battle wasn't won. He was building the World Wide Web, a system of interconnected documents readable by anyone, navigable through links designed to make the internet not just functional but human. Not just a network of machines talking to each other, but a universe of information accessible to any person with a screen. He released it, not as a product, not as a patented technology. He gave it away, freely, to the world. But here is the brutal truth that most people forget. The World Wide Web is not the internet. The web is a layer that runs on top of the internet. And if the internet had been locked down, if it had been handed to AT&T or kept as an academic preserve or strangled by restrictive legislation, the web would have had nowhere to live. Tim Berners-Lee's gift to humanity would have had no home. The gift was ready. The house hadn't been built yet. Now imagine what would have happened if the battle had been lost. Imagine a world where, in the early 1990s, the commercial internet was either blocked or handed to a handful of monopolistic corporations. You want to access information online. You pay AT&T a monthly subscription. You can access their approved content on their approved platforms at their approved speeds. I'll want to start a business online. You negotiate with a telecom giant for access to their network. Want to share information freely? You don't, because the company controlling the infrastructure decides what travels and what doesn't. In this alternate reality, there is no Google, because 2 graduate students in California couldn't have just launched a search engine from a garage. There is no Amazon, because a startup selling books online would have had to pay enormous fees to access the controlled network. There is no Wikipedia, no YouTube, no WhatsApp, no open source software, no viral social movements, no Arab Spring, no #MeToo, no decentralized journalism. There is a network, yes, but it looks more like a shopping mall than a public square. Curated, monetized, controlled. On the most powerful communication tool in human history, reduced to a cable TV system with a keyboard, that world almost existed. Back to the critical moment. It is 1992. The bill is moving through Congress, but the opposition is organized and the outcome is far from certain. The telecommunications lobby is spending enormous sums. The academic community is split. There are politicians who genuinely don't understand what the internet is and are simply voting with whoever has the most persuasive lobbyist. And behind the scenes, the National Science Foundation is having its own internal crisis. Because even if the bill passes, someone has to figure out how to actually transition the network from government control to something open. The infrastructure, the backbone lines, and the routing systems, all of it had to be carefully decommissioned and handed off without breaking the network that thousands of researchers were now depending on every single day. One wrong decision at this moment, one wrong vote, one corporate deal struck in a closed room, one technical failure during the transition, and the entire thing could have been locked down, sold off, or simply collapsed. The tension in this moment is almost impossible to overstate. The people making these decisions did not know what they were deciding. They didn't know that within a decade, billions of people would live their lives through this network. They didn't know they were holding the future in their hands. They were just trying to solve a political problem on a Tuesday afternoon in Washington. And then quietly, without fanfare, the bill passed. In 1992, the Scientific and Advanced Technology Act was signed into law. Commercial activity on the internet was permitted. The gates opened, not with an explosion, not with a celebration, with paperwork. The following year, 1993, the National Science Foundation began the process of transitioning the internet backbone to commercial operators. It was methodical, careful, and deeply unglamorous, but it worked. And then, like a dam breaking in slow motion, everything changed. Within 12 months of the transition, the first commercial web browsers appeared. Mosaic arrived in 1993. Netscape came in 1994. By 1995, Amazon had launched. By 1998, Google existed. By 2004, over 800 million people were online. Today, more than 5 billion human beings use the internet every single day. 5 billion people who almost had nowhere to go. The consequences of what almost happened ripple through everything we take for granted. Every startup that launched in a garage, every social movement organized through a hashtag, every family that video called across an ocean, every student who learned from a YouTube tutorial, every journalist who broke a story through a blog, all of it traces back to that thin sliver of time in the early 1990s when the internet hung in the balance. The scientists who feared commercialization weren't entirely wrong, by the way. The internet did become dominated by advertising. Corporations did accumulate enormous power on it. The open, collaborative, idealistic network they loved was transformed in ways they never imagined. But it remained open enough. Open enough for the impossible to happen. Open enough for voices that had never been heard to speak. Open enough for Tim Berners-Lee's gift to find a home. What we almost lost wasn't just a technology, it was a possibility. The possibility that any human being anywhere on Earth could access the same information, connect with the same people, build the same things as anyone else. The internet is far from perfect. It has caused real harm. It has amplified hatred and misinformation and surveillance. But its fundamental architecture, open, decentralized, without a single point of control, was the result of a fight that most people never knew was fought. A congressman from Virginia whose name almost no one remembers. Scientists who argued in meeting rooms about rules that sounded boring. A physicist in Switzerland who gave away the most valuable thing he ever built. And a network born from the fear of nuclear war, us that somehow survived the much quieter war over who would own it. History didn't change that day, but it came dangerously close. The next time you open a browser, send a message, watch a video, or read something that shifts the way you see the world, remember that none of it was inevitable. It was chosen, fought for, almost lost. And somewhere in the machinery of history, in the paperwork and the politics and the small decisions made by people who didn't know what they were deciding, the world got lucky. If you enjoyed this story about a moment when history almost changed, make sure to subscribe. More unbelievable, almost happened events are coming every week.